Hi, welcome everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute. We're just going to wait for folks to enter into the room. Okay, so it is with great pleasure that I get to introduce two amazing scholars and also friends to present work on relevance to their new book, Our Ancestry, Our Past. Both speakers joined Vanderbilt fairly recently. Dr. Jada Benn Torres is an associate professor of anthropology and the director of the Laboratory of Genetic Anthropology and Biocultural Studies at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. She received her PhD from the University of New Mexico and completed a postdoc at the University of Chicago, after which she was an assistant professor at the University of Notre Dame for 7 years. Her primary research area is the Anglophone Caribbean, where she explores genetic ancestry and population history of African and Indigenous Caribbean peoples. A second emerging area of her research combines the tools and theories of genetic epidemiology with anthropology in order to holistically examine health disparities. This work focuses on women's health disparities with a specific focus on the uterine fibroids among women of African descent. Dr. Gabriel Torres Colón is a cultural anthropologist with research and teaching interests in race, politics, sports, and intellectual history. He completed his PhD at the University of New Mexico, postdoc at the Center for Women's Intercultural Leadership at St. Mary's College, and was faculty at Notre Dame in the Department of Anthropology. His ethnographic research includes the politics of difference among Christians and Muslims in the Spanish enclave of Ceuta, racial experiences in US boxing gyms, cultural understandings of ancestry in the Caribbean, and the relationship between everyday life and political ideology in Puerto Rico. He also researches the intellectual history of race and anthropology and the intersections between early American anthropology and philosophy. Drawing on anthropological, feminist, and philosophical insights, Dr. Torres Colón theorizes across his work how humans embody and politicize differences in various social contexts. His research and writing employs methodologies from the humanities, social sciences, and biological sciences. We are very happy to have both of them speaking with us today. And so without further ado, I will go ahead and let them begin. Thank you so much.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to be here, and we're very excited to present our book. This is the culmination of, goodness, maybe 12-year collaboration of me doing my lab work and Gabriel doing his ethnography. But we're here to share with you what we've put together, some of the highlights of conversations we've had that ended up in this book, Genetic Ancestry, Our Stories, Our Pasts. So in terms of the structure of our book and the outline, the central proposition in our research and actually in our book is that in order to gauge how humans have experienced genetic ancestry, we have to understand the 4 things we have listed on the screen today. So first, we really need to understand the science behind genetic ancestry. And this is something we cover early in the book. We also talk about the different ways in which humans think about their ancestors. So how people think about themselves in the present in relation to the past. We're also interested in learning more about and thinking critically about the social, cultural, and intellectual contexts in which people engage in scientific data, but specifically with genetic ancestry. The fourth main theme in this book that we explore really focuses on the ways in which race shapes how we think about ancestry today and in the past, as well as social differences. So as we explore genetic ancestry in this book, we discuss the science, discuss a bit of the statistics, as well as the social meanings of this technology. This book was actually written with the non-specialists in mind. Okay? And the idea here is that we wanted to elicit cross-disciplinary discussions and to cross-disciplinary borders so that we could have interesting conversations on the ways in which people engage in technology and really just engage with science in general. So if we jump right in and look at the genetic ancestry industry, it's actually part of a larger industry known as DTC, or direct-to-consumer genetic testing. So for a fee, you buy a kit, you spit it in a little tube, send that kit back to a testing company, and they'll test your ancestry. So this has actually become a big business. From this infographic from Global Markets Insight, you could see that 2 years ago in 2019, the DTC industry exceeded $1 billion. So it's a big business. So the market emerged in the late 1990s with the first and still most popular test being paternity tests, and has since expanded. Okay, so there's a variety of different tests that you can buy, some which will look at your ancestry, which is what we focused on. And there's other tests out there that will tell you other things about your ancestry. So you might be interested in learning about your health or other elements of your life. There's definitely some snake oil out there. There are tests, for example, that will tell you your wine preference or your propensity to cheat or infidelity. Okay, so it's an unregulated market. Nonetheless, it is a big, big market. So again, we wrote this book for these sorts of customers, people who are interested in finding out what their DNA has to say and what it can tell them about the meanings in their life. So genetic ancestry specifically connects with these themes of evolution, not only as it being illustrative of a microevolutionary force, in this case, gene flow, but it also connects in the sense that, like evolution, genetic ancestry has a lot of misconceptions surrounding it. And we wrote this book to address some of these misconceptions. So to begin with, I want us to look at a little commercial. Many of you have seen some of these different commercials. This one is an Ancestry.com, and it features a customer by the name of Kyle. So let's see what Kyle has to say.
Growing up, we were German. We danced in a German dance group. I wore lederhosen. When I first got on Ancestry, I was really surprised that I wasn't finding all of these Germans in my tree. I decided to have my DNA tested through Ancestry DNA. The big surprise was we're not German at all. 52% of my DNA comes from Scotland and Ireland. So I traded in my lederhosen for a kilt.
Ancestry has many paths to discovering your story. Get started for free at Ancestry.com.
Growing up, we were German.
Right, so there are several commercials like Kyle's, and these products are actually marketed in ways to be very lighthearted, and sometimes they highlight the commonalities that we have as a human species. They play on these ideas of family and on kinship, and at times can actually undermine notions of nationalism. But they also draw attention to misperceptions about race and biology. So in this case, Kyle's ancestry test actually caused him to discard his family history of being German in place of being Scottish. As we look at these commercials and others like it, we really need to critically ask, can any genetic test determine our cultural or social identities? Okay, short answer is no. We talk about this in the book, and we're going to talk about it today. So these questions regarding the relationship between social identities and genetics and biology in a broader sense, these things that we use to query the past and the present, these are all things or themes that we grapple with in the first 4 chapters of our book. Today, we're going to highlight some of these things, but we're really going to focus on the messages of the last few chapters of our book, really to make the point that we give genetic ancestry. We believe that genetic ancestry goes actually well beyond evolutionary sciences. But instead, genetic ancestry is contingent on the context in which the technology is sought and the context in which the technology is used.
So if we want to boil that down, the idea that Jada just elucidated, here's how we do it, all right? We say that there's no natural relationship between genetic ancestry technology and how people interpret genetic information. We're playing on if there's anybody out there that happens to be in this talk familiar with social linguistic or linguistic anthropology or the philosophy of language, this comes, we sort of rip this off, the idea that there's no natural relationship between language and the things out there in the world. And here, of course, you know, the language would be the genetic ancestry technology, and the things in the world would be the people who live social, culturally meaningful lives. And so what we're saying is that again, there is no natural relationship between genetic ancestry technology and how people interpret genetic information. Rather, the social cultural context in which people encounter genetic ancestry provides a prism for what genetic ancestry means and ultimately what value it carries. This point is often lost when academics launch critiques about genetic ancestry technologies, even when such critiques are intellectually sound and academically necessary, mainly the one that we just ourselves launched, which is that we have to be careful because genetic ancestry does not equal race. This sort of valid critiques that are pedagogically useful, we also sometimes in trying to be, public intellectuals, we fly over the many other ways in which genetic ancestry might be out there in the world that does not involve a genetic an ancestry.com commercial. To complicate matters more, and this we address quite a bit in the book, is that race is in the picture. It's this wedge between two very general phenomena, right? On the one hand, what is the science of human biological variation? Who does the science of human biological variation and how they do it, right? So it's the culture of science and how genetic ancestry is out there in the world. Well, the question of race is wedged between those two issues, right? Why? Because race as a social, cultural, historical reality is in science from early in the 19th century, and it's in everyday life, right? So it makes it impossible to disentangle science from social context. In other words, when it comes to humans studying humans, the scientific method alone cannot guarantee a reasonable objective outcome, all right? So one of the things that we do in this book is that we, in the middle of discussions about genetic ancestry and cultural understandings of the past, we dedicate a chapter to the intellectual work of Antonin Vermillion, Haitian scholar in the 19th and early 20th century, who wore many hats. Political philosopher, scientist, anthropologist, historian. And we don't want to spend too much time here, but I want to highlight that in 1883, Vermillion travels to France and joins the Paris Anthropological Society in 1884. The reason why we spend so much time thinking about Vermillion is because Vermillion's book on the equality of the human races anticipates anthropology's sort of canonical moment early in the 20th century with Franz Boas' Mind of Primitive Men. Franz Boas' Mind of Primitive Men is the way in which American anthropology becomes a four-field discipline, with culture anthropology, linguistic anthropology, biological anthropology, and archaeology being all in one place. Well, one of the works that really justifies this unification of four different subfields in anthropology is a book that makes an argument against biological determinist notions of race and the hierarchical ordering of races, right? So Boas is often cited as the person that brings this to the world, right? He's a public intellectual. He's in conversations with a lot of progressive public intellectuals of the era. And what we're trying to point out is that this actually has a very similar parallel precedent in Vermillion's work. So Vermillion publishes in 1884. And Vermillion in this book, just like Boas does in his work, engages evolutionary science head on. It's a scientific work, and you see the subtitle of the book, A Positivist Anthropologist, is meant to signal this is a serious work of science. It's historical, and it's also critical of the manner in which science handles the topic of race. And this was, far from what we might imagine the world of ethnic studies to be today, as somewhat interdisciplinary, marginal, outside of the social sciences or the biologies. Vermillion was all of the above. He believed in the progressive promises of the French Revolution, and so he saw science as a tool of liberation. Again, just to do a lot in very little time, I just want to bring your attention to one of the several times in which Vermillion tries to summarize his project. the Equality of the Human Races, which is the only available English translation, to my knowledge. At one point, Vermillion writes, and again, excuse the lengthy quote, but I think it's worth it, right? So, where the human species is one or many, my thesis will will be no more or less difficult. And so, immediately, what we have is an attempt to undermine the very assumption that evolutionary thinking about humans has at the moment, right? He is very, very solidly grounded in a anti-racist liberation philosophy and politics of the time. Of course, it's fitting for a Haitian to be the one to take this strong stance before a group of anthropologists in Paris, right? And so you can see here, he understands polygynous theories of the time. He addresses them head on in the book, and he has a very structured scientific argument. But the last part of this quote, right, is that Vermillion is alluding to the known equality, to the known worth of the Black race, right, as he is calling it at the time. Of course, we have to keep in mind what data is and isn't available in 1884. So this is the language that he used, and so yeah, so we don't just spend time for men just to sort of go back in history and say, hey, look at this person, he's really neat, we should all know about it, but really to start to use intellectual history as a way to rethink how we theorize today, right? Not just claiming an ancestor, but to think about how it is that we might be missing in our own science, in our own evolutionary thinking, in our own anthropology, an anti-racist ethos. There we go. And so we turn from men, both in the book and here, to a biocultural approach to genetic ancestry. One, which we have, loosely called as a possibility of genetic ancestry as empowerment. And then again, leaning on Vermillion and sort of rethinking about what that means for our theorizing and our fieldwork interventions today, we make a claim that genetic ancestry is one of many ways we can know about our past. That is, we shouldn't just assume that genetic ancestry comes with the weight of science and equally affects everyone in every community. People already have ideas about how the past works. People have ideas about how genetic traits are passed down from generation to generation. Sometimes they're, we might call them folk genetic traits, but people have ideas. And so when genetic ancestry comes to them, it enters the social cultural reality of other ways of knowing about the past and ancestors. We also, because of this, we hold that people can and should have a say in the interpretation of their ancestry results, right? And there's no perfect way to go about this. The fact is that we're not arguing that they change, our graphs and the numbers from, particular genetic ancestry measurement via population genetics. We're just saying that every genetic ancestry result needs to be interpreted in one way, and we're proposing collaboration as a way to interpret these results. And equally, when these results are disseminated, that they are done so in consultation with research participants. Okay.
So with that, I want to share with you some of the recent work we've done that employs some of the ideas that we talk about in the book. So in the book, I actually describe some of the population genetic work that I've done in Jamaica, in Trinidad, and St. Vincent. And we talk a little bit at the end of this project that we've more recently started in Puerto Rico. So this is a really interesting project to us. This is Gabriel's hometown, his island, but it's started and stopped because of like natural disasters and pandemics. So we initially began the work, and then Hurricane Maria happened, so we had to stop, and it took a minute to find all of our participants, and then this pandemic hit. In the meantime, we have been able to get some funding, so once things sort of calm down a bit, we're going to get back to the field. But in this project, we've titled it Race, Genetic Ancestry, and Discourses of Belonging in Puerto Rico. This is a collaborative project. We're working with a community partner, Maricruz Rivera Clemente, and she's a sociologist and a community activist. And with this project, it is community-based. We are aiming to explore Afro-Puerto Rican genetic ancestry and cultural identity. So we have three main goals in this project. The first is really to use population genetics to identify and to explore genetic origins of Afro-Puerto Ricans. Okay, so there's a lot of gaps in knowledge in terms of where people came from, how they moved about the Caribbean, how they may have ended up in Puerto Rico. Secondly, we want to examine how Afro-Puerto Ricans understand biological and cultural dimensions of their past. So we're going to do ancestry testing among the group, and then we're going to give these results back and talk to them and learn a bit more about how they understand the past. One caveat I haven't mentioned here is this community group that we're working with. These are a community of artisans, so musicians, dancers, painters, poets, etc. So our idea again is to do this genetic ancestry work, give the results back to them. And then our third goal is to really facilitate local artistic interpretations of the genetic ancestry and community history. Ultimately, we hope to create a permanent exhibit out of the community center that we're working with that covers not only the science of genetic ancestry and the genetic ancestry of Afro-Puerto Ricans, but how they interpret it, how they understand their past. So in terms of the population genetics, these are some of the central questions that I'm most interested in. So I want to know more about African origins. Where are people in Puerto Rico or have landed in Puerto Rico? Where do they come from within West Africa? Is it the same or is it different than other members of the African diaspora? And then eventually, do these sorts of differences have any sort of impact when we think about health and other relevant outcomes? I'm also interested in learning more about the sources of ancestral diversity. So not only diversity from different parts of West Africa, but other parts of Europe as well as the Americas. I want to focus in a little bit more and also look at inter-island variation. And this actually fits well with some of the ethnographic aspects that Gabriel will talk about. But to get an idea of how we can use DNA to understand movement within the island and how different communities may be related to one another. And then finally, I kind of want to take a regional look. How do Afro-Puerto Ricans look next to other members of the African diaspora throughout the region? So aside from doing some of the logistics of this study, and I mentioned we've been contending with hurricanes and now pandemics, one of the scholarly challenges that we faced as we designed this study and worked with our community group was how to appropriately define a study population. As many of our audience is aware, in evolution, your unit of study is the population, and you have to be able to define that population in order to address some of the questions that you might be interested in. So this question of population was actually something I thought a lot about, given my background and experience in working in the English-speaking Caribbean. Okay? As I was approaching this and in many discussions with Gabriel and our community partner, I really had to think about what was the best approach to understanding this idea of Blackness in Puerto Rico. So prior to going to the field, I was aware of the politics of identity in Puerto Rico, especially those politics surrounding this idea, this notion, this identity of being Afro-Puerto Rican. At times it was actually quite contentious. And what this stems from is that in Puerto Rico, there is a national narrative of a tricultural heritage, okay, where Puerto Ricans claim ancestry from Africans, from indigenous Americans, as well as Spanish peoples. So this assertion of a tricultural heritage also means that individuals cannot claim one ancestry over the other. And this is what that image in the middle is really alluding to. So while people do have ancestry from Africa, they have ancestry from Europe, and they have ancestry from the Americas. For some Puerto Ricans to actually emphasize one over the other, it becomes a very, very political statement. So despite this national narrative and some of the complexities surrounding self-identification, and again, how we are to think about our population in terms of sampling and who to speak to, who to include in the study, we actually encountered a contingent of people on the island that do strongly identify with their African heritage. And this is evident in our field work, in online forums, in community groups, in different academic circles. And these are some of the things that I have shown on the screen. In addition, you can see from the textbooks there's a number of scholars that have actually studied various aspects of what Blackness means in the context of Puerto Rico. So here I've got books written by different anthropologists and sociologists. All of these really highlight the complexities of race and racism in Puerto Rico. In addition, I've included a little snapshot of an article that showed up in earlier this year, I guess it was last year, in the New York Times. And this is specifically about self-identification on the census with regard to different Puerto Ricans. Okay? And then it's kind of the same thing that you see, or actually a figure shot from that article, Don't Let Them Erase You, from the census. And I share all of this with you to think about sort of these cultural aspects that actually have an impact on how I, as a population geneticist, might go about designing my own studies and thinking about the question of population. So a second factor that was at play when we initiated this study was that the community we had hoped to recruit from already actually had some familiarity with anthropological genetic research. So what I have shown here are different screenshots of studies that occurred in the early 2000s. Okay? And the results of these studies quickly entered the popular imagination. In part, the results from most of these studies really highlighted the tricultural heritage from Spain, from Indigenous America, as well as West Africa. In fact, the most cited aspect of the result was the high percentage of Puerto Ricans who had maternal Indigenous ancestry. So every year around October 12th, some people call it Columbus Day, Indigenous Persons Day. It's actually called in St. Croix and Puerto Rico Friendship Day. But right around that day, the media will hit on these sorts of studies and reiterate this point that there's a lot of Indigenous ancestry in contemporary Puerto Ricans. So despite the previous work that had already been done, when we were conducting our preliminary field work in the spring of 2017, community members in the Piñones section of Loíza, they expressed their dissatisfaction with the manner in which some of these results and sort of the reactions of other Puerto Ricans, they found it unsettling. Okay? Also, sort of in response to the media reaction, they really felt excluded from these sorts of studies. Okay? In particular, it was this emphasis on Indigenous ancestry. This tended to occur in ways that excluded other ancestries, but namely African ancestry. So the sentiments of the community members in Piñones were consistent with what other scholars had been writing about with regard to the marginalization of Blackness in Puerto Rico. Okay? So this is another sort of thing or factor we had to address as we were working with this community. So related to this issue raised by the community in terms of how representative are these studies of their own communities, it's also important to note that the studies I have pictured here used census data in order to sample. So there's this very systematic way, and it's not a terrible way, to try and get a snapshot of the variation that might exist in a place at any given time. However, historically, we know that censuses can have their shortcomings. Okay? Sometimes there are people who avoid being counted in the census for one personal reason or another, to avoid discrimination, to avoid displacement. And other times there are political reasons where only certain groups are targeted. Okay? In some of the earliest censuses taken in Puerto Rico, for example, by undercounting Indigenous people, it made it a little bit easier to take their land, to annex their land. So there's problems with census data. And again, if you're building your population genetic study over that and you're not acknowledging maybe some of the shortcomings, you do have to question how representative your sample is. Okay? So in the case of populations that have been marginalized and minoritized, maybe using the census is not the best way to get a snapshot of who is there. So it's within this context, these questions of population, these questions of representativeness, that our community partnership was forged, and we began to explore African ancestry in Afro-Puerto Ricans. So in terms of our sampling scheme, we actually used a lot of qualitative and ethnographic methods to obtain a more critical and attentive approach to population as it's lived, as it is actually experienced and exists among Afro-Puerto Ricans. From the outset, we had local community buy-in. So peoples were incorporated into our study and intellectually invested into the work. We actually spent a lot of time with boots on the ground, 5-6 months, just hanging out, getting to know people. And over the course of 2.5 years, we were able to recruit small numbers and sort of get word out as to what we were doing. So Gabriel will speak a bit more about it, but he's conducted some structured and unstructured interviews in which he's collected information on genealogies, on family and history, communities where people have moved around, some of the terms and ideas that people throw around with regard to race and racial classifications. And all of this has been folded into how we went about studying our group, our communities. So here's a quick map of some of the places. This is the very first phase of the study. We have a small sample size, but these are regions where we got some data. So I'm skipping a whole bunch on the methods, and I'm just going to jump to some of the results. But again, this is really just to drive home the point about genetic ancestry and the variable ways in which it might be interpreted. Okay. So what I'm showing here is the results of a principal components analysis. So we've got principal component 1 and 3. So this is a data reductive technique that allows you to sort of summarize and visualize how genetically similar individuals are in your population. So we have our reference groups. These are depicted in the different colors. So you can see Africa's in red, the Americas are in blue, East Asia's in green, etc. And then we have comparative groups from the Caribbean. So these are 1,000 genome populations, for those of you that are familiar with them. So ACB are African descendants from the Caribbean, but actually from Barbados. And then PUR are Puerto Ricans, so general populous Puerto Ricans. And then the circles represent Afro-Puerto Ricans. And what you'll see in this principal component, at least along principal component 1, you see kind of these regional distributions where you have Africans sort of on the right side and the non-Africans on the left side. With principal component 3, you see North Americans, and on the bottom, you see kind of a split with all others. Okay. What I'm going to draw your attention to are all the circles that are in the middle. So those are our Afro-Puerto Ricans, and you see that they're distributed basically between African, European, and Native American. So somewhere in the kind of middle of this plot, again, indicating kind of this tri-hybrid ancestry. You will also see that the Afro-Puerto Ricans are kind of wedged in between general populous Puerto Ricans and those from Barbados. Now this trend in terms of sort of this long sort of smear of ancestry where you have some Afro-Puerto Ricans who have much more African ancestry, and then you have other Afro-Puerto Ricans who have very little African ancestry. This is a similar trend that we see within African Americans in the United States. And when this occurs in the United States, it's typically explained as reflective of what is known as the rule of hypodescent, right? So the one drop rule. So individuals with even just a little bit of African ancestry, African descendants, are socially supposed to identify as African American. Now, I don't want to argue that this is the same thing that's happening in Puerto Rico. We actually have very good information, not only from our participants, but from anthropologists, sociologists, et cetera, that race actually functions somewhat differently in Puerto Rico. Right? Nonetheless, you do sort of see this distribution of ancestries in this community. Yeah, so I think Gabriel is going to step in. He's going to tell us a little bit more about the ethnographic aspects of how genetic ancestry fits in with thinking about issues of race, the past and the present.
Yeah, and to stay along this line of thinking critically about populations, we can sort of return and step back and say, are Puerto Ricans a population? Well, if we just take a population as a breeding population, it gets complicated, right? It doesn't seem to be quite the whole story. We're certainly arguing that when it comes to humans, especially in contemporary times, a breeding population won't quite cut it, right? We have taken into account that in trying to access a population for biological marker like genetics, we as humans go through our human science and our human worlds to get there, right? So populations are exists within social and cultural structures, right? So the social structures refer to kin groups, institutions around which humans and populations, groups of subpopulations of humans gather around. Economic relationships, right? Those are economic groups that exist within a society. And the cultural structures of a population have more to do with sort of the ideational, linguistic and historical factors through which we are both who we are as a social group, but also how we imagine ourselves as social groups, right? In fact, one of the things that we suggest in our work is that, we have to be aware of folk theories of population. And a folk theory is simply a recognition that people have out there in the world have working theories about, cultural relationships between the world, between things in the world in which they live, right? That's a folk theory, right? It might not be scientifically right, sometimes it coincides with science, but folk theories have to be attended to when asking these questions about human populations. Particularly in Puerto Rico, as Jada already mentioned, this nationalist framework of tricultural heritage, this is known as mestizage or mestizaje in other parts of the Americas, really invites an outsider and people from the island to think about Puerto Rico as a nation, right? We have a nation and we're blended and we're all the above. And so it's okay to do a census tract based national sampling because we're an island and we are a mixed people, right? And so that's what, as Jada mentioned, that's what was done in the past. And good work, and we don't come in throwing that stuff under the water. We work with it, but we also came from a different sort of different experiences in our collaborative work in the Caribbean, where we had already been thinking about Blackness and Maroonage as a way to understand survival and microsocial groups of survival throughout the Caribbean, right? We'd seen it in Trinidad, we'd seen it in Jamaica, in Trinidad with indigenous groups, in Jamaica with maroon communities. And so we were already starting to think, quite frankly, come to nationalist understandings of populations from maroon spaces of population, right? Because these maroon spaces are not, they were both historically real, but also metaphorically useful to think about a scientific population. And in doing so, I'm going to skip a couple of slides ahead. I'll come back to this in a second. In doing so, we go from this sort of map, right? And I want to draw attention to this upper map, right? Which is one from Villa and al., which is in a previous slide. Apologies for forgetting to put the citation here, but it's cited in the previous slide. The Villa et al. Group, they end up doing this upper map where you see they explain African ancestry as being more eastward and associated with sugar mills during the cane era, sugarcane plantation era. But essentially, they miss all the pockets that we found. It's weird to say that we didn't find them. They've been there, right? I'm from this region of Puerto Rico, and if you grew up in the area of Ponce, you know that there's a place called San Antonio where everybody's Black. That's, if you don't want to know more, that's all that everybody knows at least that, right? There's this neighborhood with Black folks. But if you take this national snapshot and you do census tract, the census tract is going to miss a barrio that's a few streets, blocks wide. And they did, right? They did. And in this work, you don't really see the representation and survival of African peoples in these pockets. Again, pockets of Maroonage. We found some in the West, we found some in the Northwest, areas that if you take that national snapshot and approach population, you will miss. And so I wanna draw your attention to a phrase, an explanation from the people who we work with, right? This is both a quote of several individuals, but also a way to summarize, paraphrase similar views across the communities of Afro-descendants, meaning that, at some point we just start toying around and asking, for people's identity, because we understand that there's this tricultural heritage that prevents people from straight up saying, hey, I'm Black or I'm African American. In the US, it's quite easy because the framework allows for racial categories to be appropriated and identified with in a much easier manner. But this is almost this is both a affirmation of Blackness. I am Black because I am Black. How do you say I'm Black because I'm Black, and it's almost like I have no choice. This is who I am, right? I can't identify as something other than Black. And that phrase is attached to a sense of place, foremost. Blackness is not just some sort of random racial identifier that's an extension of colorism or color. There is a place that are places that are Black, right? There's a lived tradition of Blackness that is experienced by the people who we work with. And there's social relationships. And we found some of these that were simply fascinating. For us, the most interesting sort of ethno-historical finding was stories of migration. So even though we see a lot of Black communities that are self-identified as Black communities in the Northeast, people throughout the island recall where their ancestors came from, right? And these are some of these what we call pockets of Afro-descendientes or pockets of Afro-descendants that we sort of identified, and they're not just pockets that sit there. They have living histories. The arrows represents genealogical stories of migration, where my aunt came from, where my grandfather came from, where my great-grandfather came from. And we see this movement that explains how you end up with so many Black folks in one part of the island and not others, right? And it's not just national. There's stories of movement across the Caribbean too, particularly the ones that we have identified in the initial phase of our research was this movement between Haiti, Dominican Republic, so Hispaniola, and Mayagüez, which was in fact had a great massive amount of Afro descendants in the 19th century, as historical records show. So then again, something like this doesn't quite make sense to us. It doesn't make sense, not because we have some humanistic interpretation of where African essence is, but because it's just inaccurate with regards to Afro-descendant communities. So we want to leave time for questions. So I'll start concluding and we'll take some, but we want to understand, we want to recognize Afro-Puerto Ricans as a community that have resulted from a long history and living present of marronage, right? What we might call in Spanish marronaje. And the area that are currently identified as Afro communities, especially in the Northeast, as places of survival. They're hubs, right? They're not static places. They're hubs to which people arrive through the years. And there's a history that is more complex than we might first think of. And let me give sort of go back to Vermillion and to our overall approach to this work. Let me give you a parallel example from the world of art, right? So one of the things that we're saying is that, look, science is not science first, and then we introduce anti-racism, or we don't then decolonize the sciences. With Vermillion and with our work, we are trying to argue that a science that is not anti-racist from the very moment in which it's conceived, both in any intellectual project or in history, is not the real science, because Vermillion shows that he was actually right in his dissection of racist scientific notions of humanity. So we want to put forth science as something that, in order for it to be sharpened, and especially with regards to the human instruments of measurement, right, it has to be anti-racist. And one of our collaborators and interlocutors, Samuel Lind, there's a D missing there, I don't know if it's showing on screen, L-I-N-D, he explains something similar with regards to art, right? He says, I don't do Black art, I do art. If it looks Black, it's because I'm Black, but it's still just art. So in this painting, you see a mythical figure from the Northeast, which is an indigenous woman, an indigenous sort of like demagogue, Juisa, indigenous person, right? Which would kind of like hit that ethos of the indigenous ancestry that a lot of Puerto Ricans are proud of. And he says, look at Teresa, look at my Teresa. She just looks a little blacker to me, right? But don't set me aside because I'm Afro. I'm not an artist, a black artist. Don't put the black in front of artist. I'm just an artist, and that's my reality. Blackness is my reality, so art is my reality. And so, if that helps sort of understand our endeavor, that's where we like to communicate and conclude. Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
Wonderful, thank you so much. If folks can go ahead and enter their questions into the Q&A, we can go ahead and ask those. So I just have a very broad question. With these sort of companies that you can submit your, and get sort of your ancestry information from and your genetic information from, what are the sort of the benefits or the real negatives of doing this? You talked a little bit about them at the very beginning, and then, is this something that you warn people from doing, that you recommend people do? Do you have a particular stance on it? Just sort of broadly curious about that.
So from doing this, my own sort of genetic ancestry work across the Caribbean, and actually late last year, I interacted with a couple of community groups, people that have taken genetic ancestry tests and still meet with their sort of friends who have done it as well over a period of years, and talking about what they've learned. I have ideas about how you might approach this if this is something you're interested in. First and foremost, I say educate yourself. Make sure you know what you're buying if you're going to do this. You also need to recognize that it's not just you whose DNA, is represented in these tests, but it's your family as well. I guess in the last few years, there are a number of third-party applications. So people that have developed various softwares to help you download your raw data, upload it to their third-party site, and connect with other people across the world. If you are a genealogist, you might be really interested in this. If you're someone who's adopted or otherwise don't know much about your family, this might be a great tool for you to use, because it really will help you find other biological kin. That being said, you also need to think, well, let's say I do connect. What obligations do I have to that individual, if any? You might find out about family secrets. There might be a sibling or that you have, or you find out your parent is actually not your parent. You have to know how you might want to grapple with that. Also, there's also the issue of privacy. With these third-party applications, this is not something that happens when you go to a company, but if you take your data and upload it to a third-party application, it becomes kind of public information, and various government entities can search that. In fact, this is what happened I think it was 2 summers ago, with the search for a serial killer. They were actually able to find a relative of the serial killer, and they found him. So again, I'm not going to argue in saying that getting serial killers, off the road is a bad thing. This is a very good thing. However, people were not aware that their DNA was being used in this way. Interesting, another little sort of fun fact, I haven't done the math myself, but I have read, and again, this could be verified, but when as little as 2% of the American population uploads their data to like these third-party applications, at least 90% of European Americans could be found through these databases. And again, it's just because we're connected, right? So if we're using this technology in ways, we have to think about equity in terms of how it's used. So again, if you want to do this technology, go in with your eyes wide open. Read the fine print, read the white papers, see what you're actually buying and what you can learn, and ways to minimize any privacy or private information that you don't want out there.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you for that. I just wanted to encourage folks to go ahead and post questions into the Q&A. And if for any reason there's technical issues with that, you can always just chat it to myself or to the panelists. So I guess I was just, some other broad questions that I had is, there was a talk actually a few weeks ago where they looked at how males and females had different sort of patterns of ancestry. And I was just curious if that is something that's in the plans to kind of look at in your project, and what you might expect to find, or just sort of any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so again, just because of the time limits, and we wanted to kind of get all both the cultural and the genetic aspects, and I couldn't show you all of the data that I have already for the Puerto Rican communities. But not only just for them, but also for other communities that I've studied in the Caribbean, we do see evidence of like sex bias gene flow, where like for example, European men are contributing genes to contemporary society. African women and indigenous women are contributing genes to different to the contemporary community. Okay, so we do see sort of different genetic signals coming from males and from females. And what gets really interesting when we sort of look at the Caribbean as a whole is that it actually, those patterns can actually vary. And actually it has a lot to do with the social structures that are in place in terms of how people are able to use or take advantage of the ancestry of a parent. So for example, one island I visited was Dominica. Dominica for a long time was sort of a neutral island. The French and the British left it alone for indigenous populations. And then the French took it, and then the British took it, and they went back and forth. Eventually, the French sort of ended up with it. And the ways in which the French practiced or developed their plantations and slavery was they would stay on site. Okay, British planters, I use that term loosely, would leave the island and would hire others out. Well, on the French islands, what ended up happening is that those individuals became very invested in their plantations, and there were opportunities for gene flow, for gene exchange. And the offspring of those unions between European men and enslaved African women, they were able to take advantage of the resources provided by their European parentage. So they would get to go to Europe. And what happened there is that you have the development of a third social hierarchy or tier. Okay. So when we look at patterns of genetic variation, Dominica stands out specifically because of that history, that sort of social history of how slavery happened in those islands. And it looks very different than what we see in English islands. So yeah, we do see different influences from different sexes.
Great, thank you. So another question from Dr. Antonis Rokas. He said, great talk. I was wondering whether either of you had any thoughts on how do you combat the idea that genetics is destiny, which seems to be the common interpretation of lay people when interpreting these genetic ancestry kits.
Yeah. So in our work, we take it back to sort of like philosophy of time and space, because this is a difficult question to ask, because sometimes if we answer that question as academics, usually the answer is, well, we have to educate, right? We have to educate that that's not the case, that the genes don't determine anything. But I would argue, going back to this idea of folk theories, that people already think that genetics determine things in some way. They're folk theories. They don't use the language, the technical language that we have in anthropology and biological sciences, but they have it, right? And I'll take, for example, my mother. She thinks that she's always trying to parse out where I got my all kinds of behaviors, and she'll take it back to like a great uncle. And so that sort of thing has been happening before genetic ancestry entered this new modern sort of like phase where it's marketed as something that's recreational. So I always throw a little caution to the wind and say, okay, we want to educate people that genetics is not destiny. We have to understand a lot of people already have folk ideas about how we are our ancestors in one way or another, right? This tricultural heritage has in our popular culture in Puerto Rico, we don't just say where we came from, but I remember when I was in grade school, I knew that I was taught that I inherited my rhythm and my flavor from African peoples, and I inherited courage from indigenous people. And of course, this is terribly racist, but from the Spanish, I inherited civilization and being refined. Well, that's what people were taught in school. I mean, that is a form of genetic destiny if I've ever heard one. It's really problematic, but again, it doesn't depend on genetic ancestry. So, I mean, ultimately, yes, education for as much as we can here at college campuses and out there in the world as public intellectuals, but also understanding that this is an issue, a matter that is out of our hands because people already have these existing notions of past and ancestors.
For me, if I focus specifically on some of the genetic data, I point out aspects of the data that really can upend or cause you to question what you think you know. looking at ancestry in general and people of the Caribbean, mixed ancestry. You've got ancestry from different parts of the world. So it's always interesting for me to have a person and to ask them to self-identify and then point out in their genetic sort of family tree, well, you've got people who would self-identify differently than you do. Okay, so this sort of breaks this idea that our identities are tied specifically to any sort of genetic feature.
Let me also add that it's also useful to acknowledge the things in the world where genetics are destiny. And I joke around with this in my sports class, because sports is sort of one of these places where if you're not genetically predisposed to be 6'9" or 6'8", you're not going to be a great basketball forward. You're not, that's not all it takes to make it to the NBA now, but there is a small element of destiny in some of the things that we do in life. Sports is sort of a interesting place to sort of entertain these biocultural things, right? There's some things are innate, right? So very few, but there are some.
That's a great point. Well, I just wanted to thank you so much for both of you being here today. I'd encourage other folks to check out your book. And thank you again for taking the time. I also wanted to mention that we will have a reception that will start at 4:15. So feel free to take a little break and come back and join us. It'll be a traditional Zoom meeting, so you'll be able to interact with everyone. And we look forward to having those who can attend. So again, thank you so much. And I'll give an applause since not everyone can. But thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Thank you.